some argue that maybe Adam and Eve are mythical. Bill Craig argues that while Genesis 1 is mythical, it is making reference to real historical people called Adam and Eve. Some people argue that Adam and Eve were historical, but they were representatives of a larger population of human beings. But when I look at Scripture, and I see no way around the fact that Adam and Eve were real historical people, A, and B, that they were the sole progenitors of humanity, that they were the original pair, the original humans, and that they were, again, uniquely made in God's image to stand apart from all other creatures. I don't see how you get around that. So if that's what Scripture is teaching, the project now becomes, can we take the data from science, treat it fairly, treat it seriously, but is it possible to maybe reinterpret what we see from science, particularly in the area of human origins, in a way that harmonizes with the biblical account in light of our conviction that, there was a real historical Adam and Eve that were the first human beings and sole progenitors. So if Scripture is unyielding on a particular point, then our argument would be that that's what we are going to take to be the starting point. And then the question is it possible to make sense of the science? If the Scripture it has some flexibility, or if it's ambiguous, then we would argue that science can maybe help us interpret what Scripture says.
Yeah.
So it's not an either or, but it's kind of a both and, where there's sometimes some nuanced work that takes place.
Yeah. No, I like how you said that, because it's not about science being that ultimate authority where it trumps things that are very clear in Scripture. Like, Scripture is clear, Jesus rose from the dead, that happened, as well as God creating. But the question is, are there areas where it leaves more unclear? So, for example, like Reasons to Believe is an old Earth creation organization, so it's clear that God created. But the when did God create is not clearly defined in Scripture, and therefore there's that flexibility you speak of to allow science to kind of speak into the when, not necessarily the who, which is already clear. And so I think something similar happening here of that Adam and Eve are historical is clear, but there's less of a case for exactly when. And we'll talk about kind of how some Christians argue for a when, but we'll get to that here in a little bit. Now, if I could maybe really quickly as well, jumping in the beginning, if we're talking about a scientific case for a historical Adam and Eve, and how does science speak into that, maybe we should also build a brief case for where do you see an argument, biblically speaking, that Adam and Eve are historical versus, some Christians that would say, well, maybe it was just a literary, usage, or it was just, part of a story, but not real, so to represent something. How would you build a case that the Bible is clear about Adam and Eve being a historical pair?
Yeah, well, I think the case is largely, interestingly enough, from the New Testament, more so than from the Old Testament. For example, if you look at the genealogy that Luke presents for Jesus, it goes back to Adam, right? Or if you look at the writings of Paul in 1 Corinthians or in Romans, it's very clear that he understands Adam as being a real historical person, right? Whose rebellion against God introduced sin into creation, where he sees that Jesus as the second Adam, who is going to undo the work of the first Adam through his death on the cross. So when you look at the writings of Paul, it seems as if when you read Jesus, that he understood Adam and Eve as being real historical people. It really pushes you in that direction, that Adam and Eve were historical, they were real, and that they were the first human beings. If you look at Mark 10:6, where Jesus is speaking about the institution of marriage, this is in the context of a discussion of divorce. He, interestingly enough, convolves the Genesis 1:26 through 31 with the Genesis 2 creation account of Adam and Eve. So in his mind, when you talk about male and female being made in God's image, for Jesus, it sure seems from the text that he understands male and female in Genesis 1 to be Adam and Eve presented in Genesis 2.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's too many connections there. As you mentioned in Mark 10, Matthew 19, Jesus saying back to the beginning, God made male and female. It seems too set in stone. I have not heard a convincing argument to be like, no, all this is kind of metaphorical, and here's why. I mean, those arguments are made, and that's where the listener has to kind of compare them out. Now, I mentioned at the beginning how important kind of the doctrine of creation is and how it speaks into human dignity and value. I'm curious what you would say as far as why does it matter as far as if a Christian says, hey, I'm just going to take that Adam and Eve existed and they were 6,000 years ago, or Adam and Eve existed and maybe that's 150,000 years ago, or the Bill Craig, I think he dates it somewhere around like 750,000 years ago, Adam and Eve, or, as long as we recognize there's a historical couple, why does this conversation matter? Do you think there's importance there as far as the different Christian views on why this matters?
Yeah, I think there is an importance because it then speaks into the broader question of the scientific integrity of the Christian worldview, and specifically, are the creation accounts ultimately credible? Are they trustworthy? And so, for people who hold to an old Earth perspective, like I do, there is a very real concern that if you argue that Adam and Eve are only 6,000 years old, and that Scripture is teaching that the earth is 6,000 years old, the universe is 6,000 years old, you are adopting a position that is flying in the face of science. And there's overwhelming evidence from science for the antiquity of the universe at 13.8 billion years, the Earth at 4.5 billion years, life on Earth for 4 billion years, and even when it comes to the human origins, that modern humans, you and I, have been around for minimally 150,000 years. There's just overwhelming evidence for this. As my colleague and friend Hugh Ross has said recently, this is not a scientific debate with regard to the age of the Earth. Nobody questions, the age dates for the universe, for the Earth, for life on Earth. Now, when it comes to the question of biological origins, there's quite a bit of debate, even among those in the scientific community. And so there, I think for Christians to express skepticism about the broad claims of evolution is not scientifically out of bounds. But I think to question the claims about the antiquity of the universe and the Earth and life, I think you really are treading on weak scientific ground or non-existent scientific ground. And it does matter for evangelism because if you're telling people the Earth is 6,000 years old and it very clearly isn't, why would you take anything else seriously that is part of the Christian faith? And for young people in the church who have questions about how their faith relates to science, if they don't get good answers that make sense, sadly, many of these people walk away. The Barna surveys tell us one of the leading reasons that young people leave the church is they see incongruity between Christianity and science. And then on the other hand, there are a number of evangelical scholars who now are playing with the idea that maybe God employed evolution as a means to create, right? And if that's the case, then maybe we shouldn't treat the creation account as scientific or as historical, but maybe it's mythical, right? Or so there are other approaches that to me questions because when you go down that path, it opens up other cans of worms that you have to deal with that are theologically problematic.